It is 2 in the morning at the Porta Marina. The daytime heat has finally lifted from the Campania region, and the thousands of footsteps that echoed through the archway earlier today are gone. Now there is only the slow, methodical crunch of a single pair of boots. A night guard is beginning his patrol inside the locked gates of Pompeii. He sweeps his flashlight down the center of an empty thoroughfare. The beam washes over the massive, dark gray polygonal stones that pave the road. But as the light moves, it catches something unexpected. Wedged tight into the narrow seams between the heavy, dark blocks are tiny fragments of stark white stone. They are smooth, deliberately placed, and completely out of rhythm with the rest of the dark basalt street. Even when the guard clicks his flashlight off, leaving the street bathed only in faint moonlight, those small white chips continue to glow faintly in the dark. It is not an accident of nature, nor the remnants of a modern restoration. It is an intentional, ancient design, sitting quietly in the pavement for 2,000 years.
Welcome to History for Sleepyheads. Tonight, we are leaving the modern world behind to walk the silent, locked streets of Pompeii. When the sun sets and the gates are secured, this ancient grid transforms. You would expect a ruined city in the dead of night to be entirely swallowed by the dark, an empty shell offering nothing but shadows. Instead, it holds its own subtle illumination, waiting for eyes that know how to look. We are going to follow the lone sight guard on his nightly rounds, far away from the noise of the day, moving slowly through the deserted forum and past the dry fountains. As we walk, you will see this city not as a place of sudden ruin, but as a masterpiece of enduring engineering. And before the night is over, you will understand exactly why those small white stones were wedged between the dark paving blocks and how they quietly solved one of the most fundamental problems of living in the ancient world. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. We have the entire night ahead of us, and the city is perfectly still.
The transition from day to night in the modern town of Pompeii is a gradual, shifting tide. For hours, the streets just outside the archaeological park have buzzed with the relentless energy of the 21st century. The air has been thick with the hum of idling tour coaches, their massive air conditioning units producing a steady mechanical drone against the fierce heat of the Mediterranean afternoon. Tour guides have spent the day holding up numbered flags and brightly colored umbrellas, shepherding thousands of visitors over the uneven, ancient pavements. But as the afternoon stretches into evening, the rhythm of the modern town begins to slow. The crowds naturally thin out as the sun dips lower toward the horizon. Long, golden shadows begin to stretch across the Bay of Naples, cooling the pavement and signaling the end of the visiting hours. The perimeter of the site empties out, person by person, group by group. The last few stragglers pass through the modern turnstiles, their footsteps fading away as they head toward the train station or the nearby hotels. The numbered flags are folded up and stowed away. The bright umbrellas are closed. The modern world is formally detaching itself from the ancient one, leaving the ruins to the approaching dark. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a place of immense global value, and its transition into the night is a matter of strict, methodical routine. The responsibility of securing the site is divided into 2 distinct layers. Outside the ancient boundaries, the perimeter will be watched until dawn by the Carabinieri TPC, Italy's specialized cultural heritage police. Throughout the night, their dark blue vehicles will move at a crawl along the outer roads, their tires crunching softly on the gravel as they monitor the exterior of the ancient city. But inside the walls, the watch belongs solely to the site guards. Our guard for the night stands at the threshold of the main entrance, a structure known as the Porta Marina. He wears a dark, utilitarian uniform designed for comfort during long shifts on foot. A heavy brass keyring rests against his hip, softly clinking with his every movement, and a two-way radio is clipped securely to his belt. He waits with practiced patience in the deepening twilight. He is watching for the final members of the daytime staff to emerge from the deep shadows of the ancient archway. Soon, two maintenance workers step out from the deep shadows of the ancient archway, carrying their tools. They nod to the guard as they pass, their boots scuffing the modern pavement outside the gate. Once he is certain they are completely clear, he steps forward to begin the final lockdown. The heavy modern gates that secure the Porta Marina are made of thick, dark iron. They are a necessary, functional addition to the ancient stone, installed entirely to protect the city when the sun goes down. The guard reaches out with both hands, grasping the thick vertical iron bars, and slowly pulls the two halves together. The hinges are well oiled and meticulously maintained, but the sheer, monumental weight of the metal still produces a low, resonant groan that carries up the empty, stone-paved street.
When the two sides of the heavy gate finally meet in the center, the sound is decisive. It is a heavy, metallic clank that signifies the official end of the day. The guard selects a long, heavy brass key from his ring, finding it entirely by touch. He slides it into the massive modern padlock that binds the gates together and turns it with a firm twist of his wrist. The internal mechanism clicks heavily into place. With that single turn of a key, a definitive boundary is drawn across time. On one side of the iron gate lies the modern world with its glowing streetlights, the distant murmur of highway traffic, and its restless, unending energy. On the other side lies a city that was stopped entirely in its tracks by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, preserved almost entirely intact under millions of tons of volcanic ash and pumice. The guard turns his back to the modern street, adjusting the weight of his flashlight in his hand, and faces the quiet expanse of antiquity. He is now locked inside. You would expect the sudden isolation behind these massive stone walls to feel heavy, perhaps even desolate, like a vast museum left abandoned in the dark. Instead, the departure of the crowds reveals a deep, structured calm, as if the city is finally being allowed to exhale. The chaotic overlapping of thousands of modern voices is replaced by the simple, enduring silence of ancient stone. The air itself seems to change, cooling rapidly as the evening breeze moves in from the nearby coast, carrying with it the faint, clean scent of umbrella pines and dry earth. This city was not built to be a ruin. It was built to be a living, breathing machine of urban efficiency, and the scale of that machine is difficult to comprehend from the outside. The ancient walls of Pompeii run for roughly 3.2 kilometers, enclosing an area of about 66 hectares. These defensive walls were not built all at once, but rather in deliberate phases from the 6th to the 1st centuries BCE, standing up to 8 meters high in some places, punctuated by sturdy watchtowers. To manage the flow of traffic in and out of such a massive enclosure, the architects designed multiple monumental gates. Each one was strategically placed, linking the city to a different regional road and serving a different purpose. There is the Herculaneum Gate to the north, pointing the way toward the neighboring towns. There is the Porta Nola, the Porta Stabia, the Porta Nocera, the Porta Sarno, and the Porta Vesuvius, each acting as a vital artery for the ancient economy. But the gate where the guard now stands, the Porta Marina, was arguably the most vital for commerce. It was the primary access point from the sea, linking the bustling, noisy docks of the harbor directly to the heart of the urban grid. Because the city of Pompeii sits on an elevated natural plateau of prehistoric lava, the entrance at the Porta Marina is incredibly steep.
The ancient Roman architects understood the immense logistical challenge this steep elevation presented. Rather than building a single, wide thoroughfare that would inevitably become a chaotic, dangerous bottleneck of carts and people, they designed the gate with a highly specific dual passage system.
The guard stands at the base of this dual entrance, clicking his heavy flashlight on. The beam cuts a bright, sharp cone through the darkness. He shines it upward, illuminating the structural genius of the passage. To his left is a wide, towering archway, its vaulted ceiling built from layers of solid, ruddy brick and large blocks of stone. This was the passage meant strictly for beasts of burden. This is where the donkeys and mules would have strained against their harnesses, hauling heavy wooden carts loaded with terracotta amphorae full of grain, wine, and olive oil up from the harbor ships. The floor of this wide archway is paved with large, uneven stone slabs, deliberately left rough to offer vital purchase for iron-shod hooves straining against the steep incline. To his right, separated by a thick central pillar of masonry, is a much smaller, narrower archway. This side was built exclusively for pedestrians, keeping the fragile human traffic safely separated from the heavy, unpredictable draft animals. This narrow pedestrian tunnel is the path the guard takes tonight. He begins his slow ascent. His heavy, rubber-soled boots make a steady, rhythmic sound against the ancient pavement. The acoustic properties of the barrel-vaulted ceiling catch each footstep, amplifying the sound slightly before letting it fade into the dark. As he walks, he can feel a subtle shift in the temperature. The stones beneath his feet are still radiating a gentle ambient warmth, having absorbed the fierce Campanian sun for the past 12 hours. As the cool night air settles over the open city above, this stored heat rises in invisible, comforting waves, making the narrow pedestrian tunnel feel oddly welcoming, like a hearth holding the last embers of a fire. He walks slowly, without any sense of urgency. His flashlight beam sweeps methodically across the walls to his right and left. The masonry here is a physical record of a city that was constantly updating and repairing itself over centuries of use. He traces the beam along the large rectangular blocks of gray tufa stone at the base, moving up to the complex, neatly laid brickwork near the curve of the vault. There is no sense of looming dread in these shadows. The disaster that buried this place is a matter of distant history, a geological event that has long since passed. Tonight, the focus is only on the quiet preservation of the remarkable structures that were left behind. As he reaches the top of the steep pedestrian incline, the tunnel begins to level out. The ceiling drops away, revealing the wide, open expanse of the Via Marina stretching eastward toward the distant city center. The sky above is a deep, velvety indigo, entirely free of modern light pollution, dotted with the first pale, steady stars of the evening. The guard pauses here at the threshold. He reaches to his belt and unclips his radio, pressing the transmission button to check in with the main security office located near the edge of the site. There is a short, quiet burst of static in the night air, followed by a low, calm confirmation spoken in Italian. He clips the radio back into place, and the deep silence of the ancient city immediately returns, rushing in to fill the brief gap made by the modern technology. He is ready to step fully into the open street and begin his patrol of the ancient grid. But before he moves forward, he lowers his arm, and the edge of his flashlight beam catches a subtle, easily missed detail on the thick stone pillar that separates the pedestrian walkway from the wider cart passage. At roughly waist height,
The corner of the heavy basalt block is not sharp and perfectly squared off like the massive masonry blocks resting above it. Instead, there is a deep, continuous, sweeping groove worn directly into the hard stone. It is perfectly smooth to the touch, polished to a dull shine by decades, perhaps centuries, of repeated, daily friction. It is a small imperfection in the grand architecture of the gate, an incredibly subtle detail that was entirely invisible to the thousands of tourists who hurried past it earlier today. But in the slow, deliberate quiet of the night watch, illuminated by a single beam of light, it stands out clearly. It is a physical record of a daily, repetitive action, an enduring mark left by those who walked this exact steep path 2 millennia ago. The reason for this specific, polished wear will become clear as we move further into the domestic heart of the city, and that detail will matter again before dawn.
The guard steps out from the steep, enclosed pedestrian tunnel of the Porta Marina and out onto the wide, open expanse of the Via Marina. The physical transition from the tight, heavily shadowed archway to the open night air is absolute and immediate. Behind him, the monumental iron gates remain securely locked, serving as a heavy, unyielding barrier against the restless noise of the 21st century. Ahead of him, stretching out under a vast, cloudless Mediterranean night sky, is a city made entirely of silence. The atmosphere on this elevated plateau feels distinctly different from the air just outside the walls. Pompeii sits on a massive, uneven shelf of prehistoric lava, raised high above the surrounding plains. The air up here is thinner, cleaner, and entirely still. Without the ambient glow of modern street lamps, glowing storefronts, or the sweep of passing headlights, the darkness within the ancient walls is profound. It is broken only by the pale, distant light of a bright moon and the sharp, controlled beam of the guard's heavy flashlight. He stands for a long moment at the edge of the street, letting his eyes slowly adjust to the deep, textured shadows of the ruins. There is no rush. His patrol route is a familiar, measured loop, and he has the entire night to complete it. He takes a deep, slow breath, pulling the cool night air into his lungs. It carries a faint, dry scent of baked terracotta, ancient dust, and the distant, salty tang of the nearby sea. You would expect the layout of a ruined city, especially one that suffered a catastrophic and sudden geological event, to feel like a chaotic, ineligible jumble of shattered stone and collapsed walls. Instead, as the guard's flashlight sweeps low across the ground, it reveals the rigid, comforting mathematics of the Roman mind. Pompeii was not a medieval town, built haphazardly over winding, organic goat paths, or shaped by the chaotic whims of a growing population. It was a masterpiece of organized, deliberate civic engineering. The Romans approached urban planning with the exact same methodical precision and unyielding discipline that they applied to their military campaigns. They sought to impose order upon the wild, unpredictable landscape. The city is meticulously divided by major thoroughfares known as decumani, which run on a strict east-west axis. These wide avenues were deliberately designed by ancient surveyors to catch the full, sweeping arc of the sun from dawn until dusk, maximizing the natural light for the storefronts and public squares. Intersecting these main arteries at perfect right angles are the cardines, the secondary streets running perfectly north to south. As the guard begins to walk eastward down the Via Marina, he is not wandering through a ruin. He is moving along a precise, calculated line that was surveyed and drawn into the earth using simple, flawless geometry over 2,000 years ago. The grid is a civic blueprint made physical, and even in the dead of night, it gently but firmly guides his path, channeling his footsteps toward the center of the ancient town.
He points his flashlight directly at the ground a few paces ahead of his boots. The bright yellow beam washes over the surface of the street, revealing the sheer, monumental scale of the engineering beneath his feet. The Roman roads here are not paved with simple gravel, nor are they made of the small, rounded cobblestones you might find in an 18th-century village. They are constructed from massive, incredibly heavy blocks of dark gray stone, carefully cut into irregular, interlocking polygonal shapes. This stone is basalt, a dense, exceptionally hard volcanic rock. Long before the eruption that buried this city in the 1st century, prehistoric lava flows had rolled slowly across this region, cooling and hardening into a vast, rocky plateau. The pragmatic Roman builders did not import their paving materials from distant quarries. They simply carved into the earth directly beneath their feet, extracting these immense, heavy polygons and fitting them together like a sprawling, heavy puzzle. The craftsmanship of the ancient stonemasons is so precise that even now, after 2 millennia of weather, use, and burial, the seams between the massive stones remain incredibly tight. The dark, porous rock absorbs the beam of the flashlight rather than reflecting it, giving the street a deep, charcoal texture that feels deeply grounded and permanent. The stones still hold a faint trace of the day's warmth, a subtle, invisible thermal energy that rises gently into the cool night air. The guards' heavy rubber-soled boots make a rhythmic, hollow sound against the basalt pavement. It is a slow, steady crunch, pause, crunch, a simple heartbeat of sound that echoes softly off the empty, roofless walls of the houses on either side of the street. In the profound silence of the night watch, this repetitive acoustic rhythm becomes deeply hypnotic. There is a profound peace in the slow repetition of his walk, a sense of quiet companionship with the thousands of unnamed citizens who walked this exact same pavement centuries ago, their leather sandals wearing microscopic layers off the volcanic rock with every step. He continues eastward, the beam of his light swaying gently from side to side in time with his unhurried stride. Soon, the long, straight line of the Via Marina meets its first major intersection. Here, a north-south cardo crosses his path, creating a wide, open square of heavy stone in the center of the road. The guard naturally slows his pace and brings his flashlight up, illuminating an intricate physical barrier built directly into the center of the street. Sitting dead center in the middle of the intersection are 3 massive, oval-shaped blocks of solid basalt. They are raised roughly half a meter off the flat surface of the road, placed carefully side by side, like stepping stones in a wide, dark river. These are the ancient crosswalks of Pompeii, a brilliant solution to a very specific urban problem. The Romans designed their city streets to be highly multifunctional. Pompeii did not possess a modern subterranean storm drain system to handle heavy rainfall. Instead, the deeply recessed streets themselves were explicitly engineered to act as open channels for water. When the torrential Mediterranean rains fell during the wet winter months, or when the dozens of public street fountains naturally overflowed, the runoff would pour directly down the center of these paved roads. The steep incline of the city allowed this water to flow rapidly downhill, washing away dirt, animal waste, and the daily debris of the markets, carrying it all safely out beneath the city gates and into the sea. To cross a flooded, fast-moving street without soaking their expensive leather sandals or ruining the hems of their heavy woolen tunics, the citizens of Pompeii relied entirely on these massive raised stones. A pedestrian could simply step up from the elevated sidewalk, walk confidently across the high, flat tops of these basalt blocks, and reach the opposite side of the intersection entirely dry, stepping lightly over the rushing water below. But as the guard sweeps his focused light over the heavy stones, another brilliant piece of logistical engineering reveals itself in the shadows. The three raised blocks are not pushed flush against one another. There are distinct, carefully measured gaps between them. These empty spaces are roughly a meter wide, perfectly and deliberately calibrated to allow the wheels of Roman wooden carts to pass through. The beasts of burden, the sturdy mules and heavy oxen, would navigate the intersection by stepping carefully through the narrow gaps, while the heavy, iron-rimmed wooden wheels of their supply carts would slide perfectly on either side of the raised stones. Over decades of relentless daily commercial traffic, the sheer weight of those carts left a permanent mark on the city. The guard steps closer, lowering his flashlight to illuminate the flat pavement directly beneath the gaps in the crosswalk. There, ground directly into the solid basalt road, are deep parallel ruts. They are smooth trenches cut straight through the dark volcanic rock. It takes a staggering amount of friction to wear away solid basalt, but the daily grind of thousands of heavy iron wheels dragging over the exact same path day after day slowly carved these grooves into the earth. They are a permanent physical memory of the heavy traffic that once rumbled through this intersection, frozen forever in the stone. The guard steps up onto the central raised stone of the crosswalk. It provides a natural vantage point, a small island of elevation in the very center of the quiet grid. From here, he can look in 4 different directions down the perfectly straight, silent avenues. The stone beneath his boots has been worn incredibly smooth by the passage of thousands upon thousands of human feet. It feels less like a tragic ruin and more like a simple, heavy tool that has just been set aside at the end of a long, exhausting day, waiting quietly in the dark for morning to arrive so it can be used again.
He stands completely still for a long moment, listening to the sleeping city. There is absolutely nothing. There are no distant sirens wailing in the night, no low hum of electricity buzzing through overhead wires, no voices echoing from open windows. There is only the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of the coastal breeze brushing gently against the tops of the ruined brick walls. As he prepares to step down from the raised stone and continue his slow patrol deeper into the residential sectors, he sweeps his flashlight one last time across the wide intersection. The bright beam catches the high corner of a large, heavy brick building standing on his right. Most of the decorative ancient plaster that once covered this grand structure has long since crumbled away, exposing the rough, meticulously layered Roman brickwork underneath. But high up on the wall, roughly at the eye level of a man on horseback, a small, smooth patch of ancient plaster remains miraculously intact. The guard holds the beam of his flashlight perfectly steady on that specific patch of wall. There, painted in a dull, faded brick-red pigment, is a small, carefully stenciled sequence of numbers and letters. It is distinctly not an ancient Roman inscription. The characters are completely modern, a neat, precise administrative label that looks entirely out of place amidst the heavy ancient brick and the dark volcanic basalt. It is a quiet, unassuming mark, barely visible unless you know exactly where to point the light in the dark. It was painted there long after the city was completely buried, and long after it was violently rediscovered, by men trying to impose a new, highly scientific kind of grid over the ancient one. The reason for this faded red number lies deep in the methodical, meticulous work of a 19th-century mind,
and that precise detail will matter again when we finally reach the heavy quiet of the storerooms. Pompeii is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the empty streets of stone, but inside the walls, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
The guard steps down from the raised basalt blocks of the crosswalk, his boots returning to the flat, deeply grooved surface of the ancient street. He turns away from the open intersection, choosing a path that leads away from the dense commercial center and toward the northern edges of the city. The rhythmic, hollow crunch of his footsteps resumes, acting as a slow, steady metronome in the absolute quiet of the night. To walk through Pompeii after hours is to understand the sheer, monumental scale of what the ancient Romans built. When we think of archaeological sites, we often imagine small, neatly contained excavations, a single temple, a cluster of foundations, a carefully cordoned-off square of history. But Pompeii is not a fragment. It is an entire, sprawling urban landscape. The boundaries of this ancient city enclose roughly 66 hectares of land, an immense, sweeping footprint that stretches far out into the darkness beyond the reach of the guard's flashlight. Moving through a space this large, completely devoid of the thousands of people who normally fill it, creates a unique sense of scale. The empty streets seem to widen. The stone facades of the ruined houses, stripped of their daytime colors, appear taller and more imposing. The guard does not rush. There is no reason to hurry when patrolling a city that has not changed its fundamental shape in 2,000 years. He takes his time, letting the beam of his light sweep slowly over the quiet doorways and the empty storefronts, moving steadily toward the outer perimeter. Eventually, the dense grid of houses begins to give way. The narrow streets open up, and rising before him in the darkness is the most formidable architectural feature of the entire site. The guard raises his flashlight, tracking the beam slowly upward, up and up until it finally touches the jagged, ruined top edge of the city's defensive walls. You would expect the defensive perimeter of a city buried by a catastrophic volcanic event to have been completely crushed, reduced to an unrecognizable ring of shattered rubble. Instead, long stretches of these massive fortifications stand remarkably intact, towering over the quiet streets exactly as they did in the 1st century. They rise up from the earth with an undeniable heavy permanence, a ring of solid stone that wraps protectively around the dormant city. The walls of Pompeii run for roughly 3.2 kilometers, forming a continuous, undulating loop that follows the natural contours of the prehistoric lava plateau on which the city was built. Standing at the base of this massive structure, the guard is dwarfed by its sheer size. In some places along this northern stretch, the fortifications reach up to 8 meters high. The stone absorbs the ambient warmth of the day and slowly releases it into the cool night air, creating a faint, invisible updraft that carries the dry scent of volcanic earth. The guard steps closer, bringing his flashlight within a few inches of the stone surface. The beam reveals a fascinating, highly textured patchwork of ancient engineering. These walls were not built in a single rapid campaign. They are a physical timeline, constructed in deliberate, careful phases that span half a millennium, stretching from the 6th to the 1st centuries BCE.
In the stark, contrasting light of the electric beam, you can easily read the history of the city written directly into the masonry. At the very bottom, forming the deep, unshakable foundations, are large, roughly hewn blocks of a soft, dark volcanic stone known as papamonte. These are the oldest remnants of the wall, laid down by the early Oscan inhabitants in the 6th century BCE. They are heavy, simple, and purely functional, designed to anchor the defenses firmly into the plateau. Just above this dark foundation, the masonry changes abruptly. The guard traces the light over a section of much larger, precisely cut rectangular blocks of gray tufa and white limestone. The seams here are tighter, the geometry more refined. This is the work of the Samnites, a fiercely independent Italic people who expanded and strengthened the city's defenses in the 4th century BCE. They understood that a city of this size needed walls that were not just strong, but mathematically precise, capable of withstanding prolonged sieges and heavy battering rams. Finally, near the very top of the 8-meter structure, the flashlight illuminates the smaller, neat, diamond-shaped patterns of Roman brickwork and concrete. This is the final phase of construction, added in the 1st century BCE, when Pompeii was absorbed into the vast, expanding Roman Republic. The Romans modernized the defenses, repairing older sections and adding reinforced battlements. The guard slowly pans his light to the left, following the long, sweeping curve of the wall. Spaced at regular, strategic intervals along the 3.2-kilometer perimeter are the dark, square silhouettes of massive watchtowers. These towers project slightly outward from the main line of the wall, designed to give ancient sentries a clear, unobstructed view of the surrounding countryside and the coastline below. Tonight, these towers are entirely empty. Their internal wooden floors and wooden staircases burned or rotted away centuries ago, leaving only the hollow, vertical shafts of solid stone. The guard's light catches the arched doorway of one of these towers, revealing a deep, impenetrable pool of blackness. Inside, the wind, coming off the Bay of Naples, whistles very faintly as it passes over the ruined stone crenellations high above, a low, breathy sound that blends seamlessly into the quiet of the night. There is a profound sense of peace standing at the base of these walls in the dark. For centuries, this massive stone barrier was a symbol of tension and military readiness. It was built to keep out invading armies, to repel hostile neighbors, and to protect the wealth and the lives of the tens of thousands of people living inside the 66-hectare grid. The men who paced the top of these walls 2,000 years ago were watching the horizon with anxiety, scanning the dark for the distant campfires of their enemies. But tonight, the walls have been retired from their original violent purpose. They no longer need to repel anything. Instead, they serve only to preserve the silence. They act as a monumental acoustic barrier, catching the faint, distant hum of the modern Italian highway that runs far beyond the archaeological park and deflecting it away from the ancient streets. Inside this 3.2-kilometer ring of stone, the modern world simply ceases to exist. The guard lowers his flashlight and turns off the heavy beam for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the natural light. High above, the moon is bright and clear, casting a pale silver glow over the top of the 8-meter wall. The uneven, ruined edge of the fortifications forms a sharp, jagged silhouette against the deep indigo sky. It is a beautiful, melancholic sight, a reminder of the immense effort human beings will expend to create a sense of permanence in an unpredictable world. He stands in the dark for a long time, listening. The silence here is not empty. It feels full, heavy with the weight of the millions of hours that have passed since these stones were first cut from the earth. The city is resting, held safely in the enduring embrace of its own defenses. After several minutes, the guard clicks his flashlight back on. The sharp cone of yellow light cuts through the darkness once again, grounding him back in the present moment of his patrol. He needs to continue his route, moving gradually eastward along the inside of the northern perimeter, tracing the long shadow of the wall as it curves toward the Vesuvian gate. He begins to walk, the familiar rhythm of his boots returning to the quiet air. As he moves along the inner edge of the fortifications, he keeps his light pointed toward the base of the wall, inspecting the heavy stones for any signs of modern disturbance or structural shifting. The ancient masonry is cold and stable. But as he approaches a section of the wall where the ground begins to slope gently upward, his light catches something highly unusual protruding from the ancient brickwork. It is not stone, and it is not terracotta. It is a thick, dark, heavily oxidized piece of metal. The guard pauses, aiming the center of his beam directly at the object. It is a massive lead pipe, roughly the thickness of a man's thigh, embedded seamlessly into a hollow channel carved directly into the wall. The metal is dull gray, completely coated in a powdery white layer of ancient oxidation. It emerges from the deep masonry of the perimeter defense, curves slightly downward, and disappears straight into the earth beneath the heavy paving stones of the street. It is a quiet, unassuming piece of metal, completely dry and entirely lifeless in the dark. To the casual observer, it might look like a piece of modern plumbing left behind by an archaeological team, but this lead is 2,000 years old. It is a severed artery, a small, visible fragment of a sprawling, invisible nervous system that once kept this entire 66-hectare city alive. The exact origin of this massive buried conduit will reveal itself when we reach the highest elevation of the ancient town, and that detail will matter again before dawn.
The guard continues his slow, methodical patrol along the inner perimeter of the northern defensive wall. As he walks, the physical landscape beneath his heavy boots begins to change. The large, dark basalt paving stones of the street are no longer perfectly level. There is a distinct, steady incline. He is walking uphill, moving gradually but deliberately toward the highest topographical point within the 66-hectare grid of the ancient city. Because Pompeii sits on a massive, uneven shelf of prehistoric lava, the Roman architects had to adapt their rigid mathematical city planning to the natural rise and fall of the earth. The air here at the northern edge feels noticeably thinner, cleaner, and cooler than it did down by the steep entrance of the Porta Marina. The gentle, continuous breeze rolling in off the Bay of Naples meets the solid 8-meter-high stone fortifications to his left, creating a soft, unbroken whisper as it flows over the ruined battlements high above. It is a lonely, peaceful sound that only emphasizes the deep quiet of the sleeping ruins. The guard's flashlight beam remains focused on the ground just ahead of his feet, maintaining that slow, hypnotic rhythm of crunch, pause, crunch in the absolute silence of the night. But in his mind, he is not just tracking the surface of the street. He is tracking the complex, invisible world that lies directly beneath it. He remembers the thick, heavily oxidized lead pipe protruding from the masonry of the wall in the previous sector. That heavy metal tube was not an isolated piece of ancient debris. It was a severed artery, a vital, surviving piece of a massive, interconnected vascular system that once kept this entire urban landscape alive. The guard knows exactly where that buried conduit leads, because every single pipe beneath the streets of Pompeii, no matter how small or how distant, ultimately points back to the exact same place. He is walking toward its source.
When you consider the sheer scale of a city this large, built on an elevated volcanic plateau with no natural river flowing through its center, you would expect a city of tens of thousands to be defined by a constant, daily, grueling struggle to haul heavy buckets of water up from the dark earth. Instead, the Romans conquered the steep elevation by importing a continuous, roaring river from the distant mountains, engineering a distribution system of incredible gravity-fed complexity. The incline of the street finally levels out as the guard reaches the northernmost boundary of the city, a high point situated immediately beside the Porta Vesuvio, or the Vesuvian Gate. He stops, his breathing slow and steady from the climb, and raises his flashlight. The sharp, bright cone of the electric beam cuts through the darkness, illuminating a tall, imposing structure of solid, dark brick standing just inside the city walls. This is the Castellum Aquae, the grand water tower of ancient Pompeii.
Unlike the grand temples down in the Forum, or the beautifully painted villas of the wealthy merchants, the Castellum Aquae was not designed to be delicate, ornate, or particularly beautiful. It is a masterpiece of pure, heavy, unapologetic utility. It is a robust, circular building encased completely in a thick, rectangular brick facade, built with incredibly dense, unyielding masonry, designed for one singular purpose: to contain and distribute the immense, relentless pressure of thousands of gallons of moving water. The guard steps closer, moving his light slowly over the dark, silent brickwork. 2,000 years ago, this building was the beating heart of the city's civic infrastructure. The massive lead pipe we saw earlier, embedded in the wall, was just one of countless metal roots that spread out from this central hub, carrying fresh, freezing cold water down the sloping streets to every corner of the ancient grid. The origin of that quiet, oxidized conduit is right here, anchored securely in the deep foundations of the highest point in town. The guard reaches the front entrance of the Castellum Aquae. Today, the doorway is secured by a sturdy, modern iron grating to protect the delicate interior from trespassers. He does not need to use his heavy brass keys to unlock it. He simply steps up to the bars, wraps his gloved hand around the cold iron, and shines his flashlight directly through the gaps, sending the bright beam deep into the dark, vaulted interior of the water tower. Inside, the structure is absolutely bone dry. The heavy, unmoving silence of the night fills the empty space where the roaring, chaotic sound of rushing water once echoed off the brick walls 24 hours a day. But even in the dry, silent dark, the water has left behind a permanent, physical memory of its presence. The flashlight beam sweeps across the interior walls of the massive basin, revealing thick, ghostly white stains cascading down the ancient Roman brick. This is sinter, a heavy, hardened crust of calcium carbonate. The water that flowed into this tower came directly from the limestone-rich mountains of the Campania region. Over decades of constant, highly pressurized flow, those dissolved minerals gently precipitated out of the water, clinging stubbornly to the brick and hardening into a permanent white shell. In the harsh, contrasting light of the electric beam, it looks exactly like a frozen waterfall, a beautiful, mineral photograph of a river that stopped flowing 2 millennia ago. But the true genius of the Castellum Aquae lies at the very bottom of the dry basin. The guard lowers his light, pointing it carefully at the floor of the structure. Here, the large central pool does not simply empty into one massive, chaotic pipe. Instead, the masonry is divided with mathematical precision into 3 distinct, carefully engineered channels, known in antiquity as mycelia. These 3 channels were the ancient Roman version of a fail-safe grid, a physical manifestation of urban priority. The water flowing into the tower was divided strictly by civic importance. The first, highest channel fed the private, wealthy estates, the lavish, sprawling villas with their decorative garden fountains and private thermal baths. The second, slightly lower channel fed the large public bathhouses, the essential social and hygienic centers of the city, where thousands of citizens gathered daily. But the third, and absolute lowest channel, fed the vital network of roughly 40 public street fountains scattered throughout the city grid. In times of severe Mediterranean drought, when the rain failed to fall and the water pressure from the distant mountains began to drop dangerously low, the ancient Aquarius, the civic water manager who stood exactly where our guard stands tonight, would intervene. He would manually lower heavy wooden or lead sluice gates over the channels to restrict the flow. The system was brilliantly designed so that the private villas, the luxury estates of the rich, would lose their water supply first. If the drought worsened over the hot summer months, the public baths would be cut off next, closing their doors to conserve the dwindling supply. But the geometric calibration of the three mycelia ensured that the final lowest channel, the one feeding the public street fountains, would never run dry as long as even a meager trickle of water entered the city. The basic survival of the general population was built permanently into the solid brick of the Castellum Aquae. It was a remarkable piece of social contract engineered directly into the stone. The guard holds his light steady on those three empty channels for a long moment. He thinks about the sheer, invisible weight of the system, the unimaginable volume of liquid that once moved through this very room. The Romans did not have electric pumps, mechanized turbines, or digital pressure sensors. The entire sprawling network was driven entirely and flawlessly by the invisible hand of gravity. The water that arrived at this tower came from the Aqua Augusta, one of the most magnificent, ambitious, and complex aqueduct systems in the ancient world. It did not come from the nearby hills. It began dozens of kilometers away, high up in the remote, forested springs of the Apennine Mountains. From there, the water was channeled through a slow, carefully calculated downward gradient, dropping only a few inches for every 100 feet it traveled. It flowed through dark, subterranean tunnels carved through solid bedrock, crossed deep, plunging valleys on soaring stone arches, and traveled silently through the ancient countryside until it finally slammed into this exact brick tower at the edge of Pompeii. Water never sleeps. It does not pause for the night, and it does not rest when the city goes dark. 2,000 years ago, while the citizens of Pompeii slept safely in their quiet, locked houses, the Aqua Augusta was constantly moving, pouring millions of liters of cold mountain water into this high basin under the light of the moon. The pressure was immense, pushing the water out of the castellum, down through the thick lead pipes buried securely under the basalt streets, and forcing it to bubble up continuously in the dozens of public fountains below.
The guard turns off his flashlight for a moment, letting his eyes rest in the sudden, total darkness. Standing before the dry, towering structure, the silence is so profound that if he slows his breathing and listens closely enough, he can almost imagine the heavy, low-frequency rumble of the water, a phantom vibration stored permanently in the ancient stones. The city was a living, breathing organism, and this dark brick tower was its unyielding pulse. After several minutes of quiet reflection, the guard clicks his light back on. The yellow gleam pierces the dark once again. It is time to continue the patrol, to turn away from the high perimeter and follow the invisible downhill path of the pipes, moving back into the grid to see where that mountain water ultimately emerged. But as he turns away from the iron grating of the Castellum Aquae, he sweeps the beam of his flashlight high up toward the ruined, jagged roofline of the heavy brick structure. The light catches a deep, packed accumulation of tiny, highly porous gray stones resting heavily in the sharp corners of the ancient masonry. They look like ordinary gravel at first glance, but they are incredibly light, almost weightless to the touch. They are fragments of pumice. They did not come from the aqueduct, and they were certainly not placed there by the Roman builders. They fell from the sky long ago, accumulating quietly and relentlessly in the dark until they buried the water tower completely. The true source of this strange, weightless stone lies far beyond the city walls, and that detail will matter again when we finally look to the mountain on the horizon. Pompeii is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the empty streets of stone, but inside the walls, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
The guard turns his back to the dry, towering brick facade of the Castellum Aquae and begins the next leg of his slow, quiet patrol. He is leaving the high ground of the northern perimeter behind, stepping back into the dense, structured geometry of the urban grid. As he walks southward, the physical effort of his patrol changes. He is no longer fighting the natural elevation of the volcanic plateau. He is moving downhill, guided by the exact same gravitational pull that once drew millions of liters of cold mountain water from that high tower into the heart of the ancient city. His heavy rubber-soled boots find their familiar rhythm on the dark basalt paving stones. The sound is a slow, steady crunch, pause, crunch, echoing softly against the ruined, roofless walls of the houses on either side of the street. The air is perfectly still now. The faint, whispering breeze that rolled over the high defensive walls has faded, blocked by the tightly packed stone structures of the residential neighborhoods. The darkness here feels deeper, more enclosed, and deeply private. The guard keeps his flashlight pointed slightly downward, letting the bright, focused cone of yellow light bounce gently ahead of his feet. He is walking the exact invisible path of the thick lead pipes buried directly beneath the heavy stones. 2,000 years ago, the highly pressurized water from the Castellum Aquae rushed through those subterranean conduits in absolute darkness, surging downhill with immense, unstoppable force. Tonight, the pipes are dry, hollow, and silent, but the path they cut through the city remains perfectly intact. He follows the gentle downward slope of the street until he reaches a quiet, open intersection. Here, 4 different roads meet, forming a wide square of dark, ancient pavement. The guard pauses. He sweeps his flashlight slowly to the right, cutting through the heavy shadows resting on the corner of the sidewalk. The beam comes to rest on a large, heavy structure sitting right on the edge of the curb. It is one of the ancient public street fountains. There are roughly 40 of these public street fountains scattered throughout the 66-hectare grid of Pompeii, placed strategically so that almost no resident had to walk more than 50 meters from their front door to find fresh water. In the stark, contrasting light of the flashlight, the fountain looks like a solid, unmovable anchor of heavy stone. It is constructed from 4 massive, thick rectangular slabs of dark gray basalt, fitted together to form a deep, square basin. At the back of the basin stands a tall, vertical stone pillar, known as a stele, which rises roughly to the height of a man's chest. The guard steps closer, moving out of the center of the street and stepping up onto the elevated sidewalk. He brings his light directly over the dry, empty basin. You would expect a utilitarian street fountain to be a purely functional blank basin, built with no thought to anything other than the basic biological delivery of water. Instead, each of the roughly 40 fountains scattered throughout the grid was carved with a distinct, deliberate identity.
The Romans did not have a system of street names or numerical addresses like we use in modern cities. To navigate the sprawling, complex grid of Pompeii, the citizens relied entirely on visual landmarks. The public fountains served as the essential map of the city. The guard shines his light directly onto the tall, vertical stone pillar at the back of the basin. Carved into the hard basalt, standing out in deep relief, is the highly detailed face of a wild boar. Other fountains throughout the city bear the faces of roaring lions, silent river gods, eagles, or simple geometric rosettes. If an ancient Roman needed to give directions to a bakery, a specific tavern, or a private home, they would simply tell the visitor to walk downhill until they reached the Fountain of the Boar and turn left. These heavy stone blocks were the geographical anchors of daily life, giving every small neighborhood its own distinct name and identity. In the center of the carved boar's mouth, the guard's flashlight reveals a perfectly round, empty hole. 2,000 years ago, a thick lead pipe would have protruded directly from this stone mouth. Driven by the immense gravity-fed pressure from the Castellum Aquae high above, the water did not simply trickle from this pipe, it rushed out in a powerful, continuous, roaring stream. The Romans did not use valves or taps on their public fountains. The concept of turning the water off simply did not exist in their civic engineering. The water flowed freely and constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The deep basalt basin was perpetually full to the brim, constantly churning with fresh, freezing cold mountain water. The guard slowly lowers his flashlight to the edge of the stone basin, illuminating the heavy lip of the basalt slab. Because the water never stopped flowing, the basins were in a perpetual overflow. The excess water poured continuously over the low front lip of the stone, splashing heavily onto the pavement below and running directly into the street. This continuous overflow was not a waste of resources, it was a brilliant, deliberate feature of the city's design. The constant stream of water pouring from all 40 fountains simultaneously acted as an automatic, perpetual cleaning system for the entire urban grid. The water washed down the carefully sloped basalt streets, sweeping away dirt, animal waste, and the daily refuse of tens of thousands of people, funneling it all out through the lower gates of the city and into the sea. This is exactly why the massive raised stepping stones we saw in the earlier intersections were so incredibly vital. The streets of Pompeii were not just roads for wooden carts, they were active, flowing, shallow rivers of runoff. The guard thinks about the sheer acoustic presence of this system. Today, the ruins are defined by their profound, heavy silence. But in antiquity, the background noise of Pompeii was the constant, overlapping sound of rushing, splashing water. It was a city that hummed with aquatic life.
He stands in silence beside the dry basin, the pale moonlight mixing gently with the artificial yellow beam of his flashlight. He reaches out with his left hand and rests it gently on the front edge of the heavy basalt block. The stone is cold, completely stripped of the day's heat in this deeply shadowed corner. As he slides his gloved hand along the thick rim of the basin, he feels a distinct change in the geometry of the stone. He pauses, looking down, and points his flashlight directly at the spot where his hand rests. There, on the hard, unyielding edge of the volcanic rock, is a deep, perfectly smooth depression. It is a wide, shallow groove, polished to a glass-like finish that contrasts sharply with the rough, natural texture of the rest of the block. It was not chiseled by a stonemason, and it was not carved for decoration. It is the exact size and shape of a human hand. For decades, perhaps for centuries,
thousands upon thousands of citizens came to this specific fountain to drink. They would lean forward over the deep basin, lower their heads toward the rushing stream of water pouring from the boar's mouth, and press their hand against the edge of the stone to support their weight. Day after day, year after year, the soft, fleshy friction of human hands slowly, imperceptibly ground away the hard basalt. The guard stares at the polished depression, the beam of his light perfectly still. Suddenly, a quiet realization settles over him. He remembers the deep, sweeping groove he saw on the heavy stone pillar down at the steep pedestrian entrance of the Porta Marina at the very beginning of his patrol. The mystery of that polished ware is suddenly completely clear. The groove at the gate was not an accident, nor was it caused by the wooden wheels of carts. It was created in the exact same way as the depression on this fountain. It was the collective friction of millions of human hands. As pedestrians trudged up the incredibly steep, exhausting incline from the ancient harbor, they would reach out and grab the corner of that specific pillar to pull their tired, heavy bodies upward, seeking leverage against the steep gravity of the city. Down at the gate, the stone recorded their exhaustion and their effort. Up here at the fountain, the stone recorded their thirst and their relief. Both marks are the slow, invisible erosion caused by human survival. The city of Pompeii was not just built by its inhabitants, it was physically, softly sculpted by the repetitive daily motions of their bodies. The heavy stone was slowly molded by the soft touch of the people who lived inside it. It is a profound, deeply intimate detail, completely invisible in the chaotic rush of the daytime crowds, but undeniable in the quiet isolation of the night watch. The guard slowly pulls his hand away from the polished groove. The physical connection to the past is almost palpable, a quiet echo of life trapped permanently in the cold rock.
He takes a deep breath, the cool, dry air filling his lungs, and steps slowly backward off the elevated sidewalk. He returns to the center of the dark street, letting the dry, silent fountain fade back into the deep shadows as he redirects the beam of his flashlight down the center of the road. It is time to move onward, toward the vast, open spaces of the Civic Center. He adjusts the heavy brass key ring on his belt, ensuring it is secure, and begins to walk again. His boots resume their slow, steady rhythm on the heavy stones. As his flashlight sweeps rhythmically back and forth across the basalt pavement, the bright cone of light briefly washes over another one of those tiny, stark white stones firmly wedged into the dark cracks between the massive polygonal blocks. They are scattered intermittently along his path, quietly catching the ambient moonlight. The reason for their careful, deliberate placement is deeply tied to the total absence of street lamps in this ancient grid, and that detail will matter again before the night is through. The guard moves away from the dry, empty basin of the public street fountain, letting the heavy basalt block with its polished, hand-worn groove fade back into the deep shadows. He continues his slow, deliberate patrol, heading further south, moving toward the vast, open civic spaces that anchor the southwestern edge of the city. As he walks, the narrow, tightly packed residential streets begin to change. The tall, windowless facades of the private houses give way to wider avenues, and the architectural scale of the ruins begins to expand. He is approaching the Forum, the grand public square that served as the commercial, political, and religious center of ancient Pompeii. But before he steps out into the massive open plaza, his patrol route requires a brief detour. He turns down a short, quiet side street, his flashlight beam cutting a sharp yellow path through the darkness, and stops in front of a long, low structure built securely against the western side of the Forum. This building is known as the Horea, the ancient granaries and public markets. Today, these long, rectangular brick chambers no longer hold grain, wool, or the fresh produce of the Campania region. They have been repurposed by the modern archaeological park to serve as the primary storerooms for the tens of thousands of artifacts recovered from the ruins over the last 2.5 centuries. The entrance to the storerooms is secured by a towering floor-to-ceiling gate made of thick, heavy steel mesh designed to allow the cool air to circulate while keeping the precious contents safely locked inside. The guard steps up to the steel mesh, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the heavy brass padlock that secures the heavy sliding door. He reaches to his hip, selecting a specific modern key from his heavy iron ring. He slides it into the padlock, turns it, and pulls the heavy steel mechanism free with a dull metallic click. He slides the heavy mesh door open. It rolls along its metal track with a low, rumbling vibration that briefly disturbs the deep silence of the night. He steps inside, pulling the heavy gate shut behind him, and locks it from the interior. Inside the long, cavernous space, the air feels noticeably different. It is incredibly dry, smelling faintly of old dust, baked terracotta, and the deep, clean scent of excavated earth. The guard does not turn on the overhead fluorescent lights. There is no need to flood the space with harsh, modern illumination. Instead, he relies on the slow, rhythmic sweep of his heavy flashlight, letting the beam wash gently over the endless rows of industrial metal shelving that line the walls. The shelves are stacked with an overwhelming abundance of ancient daily life. There are hundreds of tall, slender terracotta amphora, the shipping containers of the ancient Mediterranean, resting quietly in specially designed wooden racks. There are stacks of clay roof tiles, fragments of marble columns, and heavy stone grinding wheels from the city's bakeries. Everything is meticulously organized, categorized, and cataloged. As the guard sweeps his light over a lower shelf containing a row of small, intact clay oil lamps, he pauses. Tied to the handle of each lamp is a small, pale paper tag bearing a neatly printed sequence of numbers and letters.
He steps closer, aiming the center of the beam at the tags. The sequence is formatted meticulously, a Roman numeral, followed by a standard number, followed by a final digit. Instantly, the guard's mind flashes back to the faded brick-red number painted on the small patch of intact plaster at the crossroads back in Chapter 2. The format is exactly the same. This numeric system is not an ancient Roman invention. It is the enduring legacy of a brilliant 19th-century mind. And it is the reason modern Pompeii is a place of profound scientific order rather than a chaotic, ruined treasure yard. For the first 100 years after Pompeii was rediscovered in the mid-1700s, the excavations were essentially a destructive, unorganized treasure hunt. Kings and wealthy aristocrats tunneled recklessly into the ash, tearing out bronze statues, delicate mosaics, and gold jewelry to decorate their private palaces, leaving the architectural ruins to collapse behind them. They kept no records, they drew no maps. But in the 1960s, a visionary Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli took control of the site. Fiorelli was a man of absolute method. He stopped the chaotic tunneling immediately. Instead of hunting for treasure, he decided to excavate the city from the top down, carefully removing the layers of ash street by street, house by house.
To manage this massive 66-hectare grid, Fiorelli realized he needed a system. He took a map of the city and imposed a strict, logical overlay across the ancient Roman streets. He divided the entire city into 9 large neighborhoods, which he called regiones. He numbered each city block within those neighborhoods, calling them insulae. Finally, he assigned a specific number to every single doorway on every single block. Those faded red numbers painted on the ancient plaster walls and the neat tags tied to the artifacts in this quiet storeroom are Fiorelli's addresses. Because of his meticulous work, archaeologists know exactly where every single clay lamp, bronze mirror, and terracotta pot was found. He took a ruined, nameless grid and gave it a permanent, unshakable administrative order. The guard nods slowly in the dark, a quiet gesture of respect from one guardian to another across the centuries. He turns away from the shelves of pottery and walks toward the center of the long, vaulted room. Here, resting on long, elevated wooden platforms under custom-built glass cases, are the most famous and perhaps the most profoundly misunderstood artifacts in all Pompeii. The guard slowly pans his flashlight across the glass, illuminating a series of stark white, life-sized figures resting quietly in the dark. These are the plaster casts. You would expect the presence of these human forms in a dark, silent storeroom to feel like a morbid, unsettling encounter with the ancient dead. Instead, the room holds the quiet, deeply respectful atmosphere of an art gallery. There is no horror here, no lingering dread. When you look closely at these stark white forms in the gentle, sweeping light of the flashlight, you realize that they are not human remains at all. They are masterpieces of negative space.
During his methodical excavations in the 1860s, Giuseppe Fiorelli's workers noticed something highly unusual in the compacted layers of volcanic ash. Occasionally, as their shovels cut through the dense hardened pumice, they would break into a small hollow cavity. If they looked inside, they would find nothing but empty air and a few fragments of bone. Fiorelli possessed a brilliant, deductive mind. He realized exactly what these hollow spaces were. When the eruption buried the city in 79 AD, the falling ash had packed tightly around everything in its path: wooden doors, wooden furniture, and the citizens who had not evacuated in time. Over the centuries, the volcanic ash hardened into a dense, concrete-like shell. Meanwhile, the organic material trapped inside, the wood, the fabric, the flesh, slowly decomposed and dissolved entirely into the earth. What remained was a perfect three-dimensional void, a hollow bubble trapped perfectly in the solid rock, retaining the exact shape of whatever had once been there. Fiorelli invented a breathtakingly simple scientific solution. Whenever his workers found one of these hollow cavities, they stopped digging. They carefully mixed liquid plaster of Paris, poured it slowly into the small opening, and waited for it to dry. Once the plaster hardened, they carefully chipped away the surrounding volcanic ash, revealing the solid white form that had been cast perfectly inside the void. The guard shines his light on the cast, resting near the end of the platform. It is the form of a man resting on his side, his knees drawn up slightly, his head resting peacefully on his arm. The level of detail captured by the fine volcanic ash is astonishing. You can clearly see the heavy folds of the woolen tunic draped across his shoulders. You can see the thick leather straps of the heavy sandals on his feet. You can even see the delicate physical tension in the muscles of his back.
But the guard knows, as he stands in the absolute quiet of the storeroom, that he is not looking at a body. He is looking at a highly detailed, three-dimensional photograph. It is a plaster sculpture made directly by time and geology. The person who formed that hollow void is gone for 2,000 years, returned completely to the earth. What rests under the glass is merely an impression, a shadow rendered in white plaster, perfectly preserved by Fiorelli's methodical genius. The silence in the room is deep, respectful, and calm. The guard spends several minutes walking slowly down the line of wooden platforms, letting his flashlight rest gently on the casts of heavy wooden doors, the intricate legs of ancient wooden tables, and the resting figures of the citizens. They are all made of the exact same white plaster, all created from the same brilliant process of filling the empty spaces left behind by history.
Eventually, it is time to move on. The guard turns away from the glass cases, sweeping his light back toward the heavy steel mesh door at the entrance. He unlocks the gate, slides it open, and steps back out into the cool night air. He pulls the heavy gate shut, the metallic rumble fading quickly into the open streets, and secures the heavy brass padlock with a final, decisive click. He stands on the edge of the dark, paved street, looking out toward the massive open expanse of the Forum just a few dozen yards away. Out there, the tightly packed walls of the residential streets fall away entirely, leaving a vast, wide-open plaza of dark stone. Giuseppe Fiorelli had mapped this entire city, placing his methodical grid over the ruins, but one thing he noted in his meticulous records was the total absolute absence of any fixed streetlights in antiquity. How tens of thousands of people navigated this vast, pitch-black grid at night without modern electricity was a problem the ancient Roman engineers solved with brilliant simplicity. The reason for those small, stark white stones wedged into the dark basalt cracks is about to become completely clear, and that detail will matter as we step into the darkest stretch of the ancient road. Pompeii is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the empty streets of stone, but inside the walls, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
The guard steps away from the heavy steel mesh door of the storerooms, leaving the silent plaster casts resting peacefully under their glass cases in the dark. He stands at the edge of a wide, paved intersection, the heavy brass padlock secured tightly on his belt. Before he moves completely into the vast, open expanse of the Forum just a few yards away, he turns his body to the east. He points the beam of his heavy, modern flashlight down the center of the Via dell'Abbondanza. This is the Street of Abundance. It is the longest and most important commercial thoroughfare in all of Pompeii, a massive, straight artery that cuts directly through the heart of the ancient grid, running from the civic center all the way out to the eastern gates. During the daylight hours, this street is an overwhelming, chaotic river of color and noise. It is tightly packed with modern tour groups, guides speaking a dozen different languages, and the relentless, echoing shuffle of thousands of footsteps. But tonight, looking down the long, straight line of the Via dell'Abbondanza, the street is an entirely different landscape. It is a deep, silent canyon of stone, stretching out into a profound and absolute darkness.
The guard begins to walk down this grand avenue, his boots returning to their slow, rhythmic crunch against the heavy basalt paving stones. As he moves away from the open spaces of the civic center, the tall, ruined walls of the houses and storefronts rise up on either side of him, closing in and blocking out the ambient light of the night sky. The shadows here are not just heavy, they feel almost physical, thick and unyielding, pooling in the deep doorways and ancient shop counters. To walk through a meticulously preserved ancient city at 2 in the morning is to confront a fundamental difference in how humanity once lived. Modern cities are defined by their constant, aggressive illumination. We are accustomed to a world that pushes the dark away with sodium street lamps, glowing billboards, and the endless sweep of passing headlights. But in antiquity, the night was absolute. When the sun set over the Bay of Naples 2,000 years ago, the city of Pompeii effectively shut down. The architecture of a Roman house, a domus, was inherently inward-looking. The wealthy patricians built high, thick, windowless walls facing the street to block out the overwhelming noise and dust of the daily traffic. All the light and air in a Roman home came from an open central atrium in the roof, deep inside the property. Consequently, when night fell and the citizens lit their small household fires and terracotta oil lamps, almost none of that light spilled out into the public avenues. The streets were left completely and deliberately in the dark. You would expect a city of this immense wealth and architectural sophistication to have developed a vast, organized system of public street lamps, keeping the thoroughfares safely illuminated from dusk until dawn. Instead, the concept of formal, municipal street lighting simply did not exist in the ancient Roman world.
There were no iron lampposts, no hanging lanterns, and no civic budget for burning oil in the empty squares. Once the heavy wooden doors of the shops and houses were bolted shut from the inside, the streets belonged only to the shadows. Anyone who had to venture out after dark, a wealthy merchant returning late from a banquet, or a physician called to an emergency, had to bring their own light, usually a slave carrying a flickering, wind-blown pitch torch. But there was one group of men who walked these pitch-black streets every single night, just as our modern guard does now. They were known as the Vigiles. The Vigiles were the ancient watchmen and firefighters of the Roman Republic. They were tasked with patrolling the massive 66-hectare grid while the city slept, watching for the sudden, terrifying glow of a roof fire or the quiet sounds of a burglary in the commercial district. They walked these exact basalt stones, wrapped in heavy woolen cloaks against the coastal damp, carrying small terracotta oil lamps that cast only a few meager feet of dim yellow light. Our modern guard is part of a 2,000-year-old unbroken tradition. He shares the same quiet hours, the same cold breeze, and the same slow, methodical pace as those ancient sentries. But he has an advantage they never possessed. He reaches out with his thumb and clicks the heavy switch on his flashlight. Instantly, the bright, powerful beam of modern electric light vanishes. The guard plunges himself and the Via dell'Abbondanza into total, absolute darkness. He stops walking. For a few long, quiet moments, his eyes struggle to adjust. The deep, velvet blackness of the ancient street is disorienting. The high, ruined walls on either side of him are completely invisible. The deep, heavy basalt stones beneath his boots simply cease to exist. He is standing in a void. But as the seconds pass, the deep velvet black of the night sky begins to reveal itself. High above the ruined rooflines, the clouds slowly part and the pale, clear light of a full Mediterranean moon washes down into the stone canyon of the street. The moonlight is soft, cool, and highly diffused. It does not penetrate the deep shadows of the doorways, but it gently touches the surface of the road. And as the guard looks down at his feet, the great mystery of the ancient pavement finally resolves itself in the dark. Scattered across the heavy, dark gray basalt blocks, wedged tightly into the irregular seams and cracks, are those small, stark white stones we first saw down by the Porta Marina. In the harsh yellow beam of a modern flashlight, they simply looked like random debris or a strange architectural quirk. But here, in the natural, pale light of the moon, their true, brilliant purpose is revealed. The white stones are glowing. They are small fragments of white travertine and bright, polished marble, carefully and deliberately hammered into the dark volcanic road by the Roman engineers. Because the heavy basalt rock is so dark, it completely absorbs the faint moonlight, rendering the street invisible. But the stark white marble chips do the exact opposite. They catch the pale lunar light and reflect it upward.
They act exactly like the reflective cat's eyes used on modern highways. As the guard looks down the long, straight expanse of the Via dell'Abbondanza, he sees a faint, dotted, glowing white path stretching out for hundreds of yards into the darkness, a quiet, passive trail of light guiding the way through the pitch-black city. This was not a decorative choice. It was an essential, life-saving piece of urban engineering. Navigating the streets of Pompeii was incredibly dangerous. As we saw at the crossroads earlier, the ancient streets were not smooth and flat. They were deeply recessed, plunging down from the elevated sidewalks. They were carved with massive, ankle-breaking ruts left by the heavy iron wheels of the wooden carts, and they were blocked by those massive, elevated basalt stepping stones. If an ancient watchman, a vigil, was patrolling this street on a moonless night, or if a citizen was trying to rush home with a burnt-out torch, stepping blindly off the curb could easily result in a broken leg or a severe fall. The Roman engineers understood that they could not afford to light the massive city with oil, so they brilliantly designed the city to light itself. They used the stark, natural contrast of white marble against dark volcanic stone to create a permanent, passive navigational grid that required no fuel, no maintenance, and no fire. The guard smiles quietly in the dark. He keeps his flashlight switched off. He takes a slow, careful step forward, and then another. He begins to walk down the ancient street using only the faint, glowing white stones to guide his boots. The experience is profoundly peaceful. Without the harsh glare of the modern electric beam, the city feels softer, less like a ruined archaeological site, and more like a quiet, sleeping town. The pale marble chips gently catch the moonlight, forming a subtle, beautiful constellation directly beneath his feet. He walks for several minutes like this, trusting the 2,000-year-old engineering to keep him safely centered on the heavy basalt blocks, guiding him smoothly past the deep ruts and the high curbs. The silence is absolute, broken only by the steady crunch of his boots and the gentle whisper of the wind moving through the empty stone doorways. Eventually, the long canyon of the Via dell'Abbondanza begins to widen. The tall, enclosing walls of the houses fall away, and the guard reaches the western terminus of the street. He is standing at the very edge of the Forum, the massive, wide-open civic heart of the city. He stops at the threshold and clicks his heavy modern flashlight back on. The bright, sharp cone of yellow light cuts through the darkness, washing over the grand, monumental foundations of the temples and the towering brick arches of the public buildings. But before he steps out into the vast, empty square, he sweeps his beam along the high brick wall of a wealthy estate right on the corner of the intersection. High up on the ancient masonry, entirely invisible to the daytime crowds, the light catches a small, matte black cylinder bolted discreetly into the mortar. At its center, a tiny, pinpoint infrared light pulses faintly, a silent electronic heartbeat in the dead city. The reason for this quiet, modern surveillance in a 2,000-year-old ruin is tied directly to a very real, ongoing battle for the preservation of history, and that detail will matter again when we reach the outer boundaries of the Night Watch. Leaving the quiet, pulsing infrared eye behind to guard the intersection, the guard takes a final step out of the deep, narrow stone canyon of the Via dell'Abbondanza. The transition is immediate and profoundly physical. The tight, towering brick walls of the residential and commercial streets abruptly fall away on both sides. The heavy, enclosed darkness that has pressed gently against his shoulders for the last hour suddenly evaporates, replaced by a vast, sweeping expanse of open night air. He has entered the Forum, the massive, rectangular civic heart of ancient Pompeii. To step into this space at this hour is to experience a radical shift in the acoustic and physical landscape of the city. In the narrow streets, the guard's footsteps were sharply defined, bouncing cleanly off the closely packed facades of the houses. The world felt dense, compressed, and intensely private. But out here, in the sprawling, open plaza of the city center, the sound of his boots behaves differently. The heavy crunch of his rubber soles does not echo back at him. Instead, the sound drifts softly outward, spreading across the wide, flat pavement and fading peacefully into the sheer, immense volume of the square. The Forum is a magnificent rectangular plateau, stretching long and wide on a north-south axis. During the daylight hours, this is the most heavily trafficked area of the modern archaeological park. It is a sea of bright clothing, camera flashes, and the overlapping murmur of thousands of voices. But now, at 2 a.m, stripped of its daytime crowds, the Forum reclaims its original monumental dignity. It is a place of deep, structured calm, an architectural sanctuary sleeping under the pale light of the Mediterranean moon. The guard walks slowly toward the center of the vast plaza, leaving his heavy flashlight switched off. The ambient lunar light is more than enough to see by here, unobstructed by any high roofs or narrow alleys. As he walks, he looks down at the pavement beneath his feet. The dark, heavily rutted volcanic basalt of the commercial streets has entirely disappeared. You would expect the central, most vital square of a bustling, wealthy commercial empire to be heavily scarred by the relentless traffic of the city, worn down by the same deep, parallel cart ruts we saw at the crossroads earlier. Instead, the expansive pavement of the Forum is remarkably smooth, flat, and entirely untouched by the grind of wooden wheels. The surface here is paved with broad, elegant slabs of white travertine limestone fitted seamlessly together to create a massive, unbroken stage of bright stone. The reason for this flawless, unrutted surface lies just behind the guard, at the various entrances to the square. As he looks back toward the threshold of the Via dell'Abbondanza, the moonlight catches the silhouettes of 3 tall, heavy stone pillars standing completely upright in a row, blocking the entrance to the Forum.
These are ancient bollards. They were not placed there by modern archaeologists. The Romans installed them 2,000 years ago with a very specific, uncompromising purpose. The Forum was the political, religious, and administrative brain of the city. It was the place where laws were passed, where the gods were honored, and where the most important civic business was conducted.
The ancient architects decided that this sacred, intellectual space would not be polluted by the noise, the dust, and the danger of heavy draft animals and creaking wooden wagons. By placing those heavy stone bollards at every single entrance to the square, they physically enforced a strictly pedestrian zone. The beasts of burden and the heavy iron wheels were forced to bypass the civic center entirely. When an ancient Roman citizen stepped past those bollards and onto the white travertine of the Forum, they were stepping out of the chaotic, dirty reality of the streets and into an elevated, idealized version of their city. The smooth, flat stones beneath the guards' feet are a testament to that ancient desire for civic peace. He turns back around and continues his slow walk northward, right down the center line of the plaza. The sheer scale of the space makes his slow, measured pace feel incredibly small, a tiny moving point in a vast geometric drawing. Lining the eastern and western edges of the Forum are the ruined remains of a magnificent two-story colonnade. The tall, fluted columns of white limestone stand at regular intervals like quiet sentinels, casting long, uniform shadows across the pavement. Behind these columns lie the heavy, empty shells of the city's most important buildings. The guard looks to his left, toward the western edge, where the massive brick structure of the basilica stands. This was the ancient law court and the center of financial exchange, a place once filled with the shouting of lawyers, the clinking of coins, and the heavy shuffle of thousands of sandals. Tonight, it is nothing but a grand, silent cavern of ruined brick and shadow. As he sweeps his gaze along the western colonnade, the pale moonlight highlights a series of large rectangular stone blocks resting heavily on the pavement, spaced evenly just in front of the columns. They are massive, solidly built pedestals of brick and marble, some of them standing as tall as a man. The guard pauses beside one of these heavy blocks, resting his gloved hand on the cold stone. The top of the pedestal is entirely empty. 2,000 years ago, these bases supported massive, gleaming bronze statues of Pompeii's most prominent politicians, wealthy benefactors, and Roman emperors. Many were towering equestrian statues, depicting powerful men seated on magnificent bronze horses, positioned to look down upon the citizens as they went about their daily business. They were monuments designed to project permanence, built by men who desperately wanted to be remembered forever. But time and history are remarkably indifferent to human vanity. When the catastrophic eruption buried the city, the sheer weight of the falling ash and the collapsing roofs knocked many of these heavy statues from their bases. Centuries later, the early chaotic tunnelers who first discovered the ruins dragged the remaining bronze away to decorate the private palaces of European kings.
Now, all that remains are the empty pedestals. There is a deep, quiet poetry in their blankness. The names of the politicians have largely faded into obscurity, their bronze likenesses melted down or relocated to distant museums. But the heavy, utilitarian stone bases remain exactly where they were placed, enduring the centuries in silent stillness. The guard appreciates the quiet honesty of the empty stone. It does not demand attention. It simply rests, holding its place in the grid, completely at peace with its own obsolescence. He leaves the empty pedestal behind and continues his walk, approaching the northern end of the vast rectangular square. Here, dominating the entire plaza, stands the raised foundation of the Capitolium, the Temple of Jupiter. This was the supreme religious structure of the city, the focal point of the entire Forum. It sits on a high, commanding podium, accessible by a wide, steep flight of stone stairs.
Even in its ruined state, with only a few of its massive Corinthian columns still standing, it projects an aura of immense, undeniable weight. The Romans understood the psychology of architecture. By placing the temple at the very end of this long, flat expanse, they forced every citizen who walked across the forum to look upward, both physically and spiritually. The guard stops at the base of the wide stone staircase. He does not climb the steps. His patrol requires him to stay on the main level of the plaza, monitoring the perimeter of the public buildings. He stands perfectly still at the bottom of the temple, listening. The silence of the forum is absolute. It is a heavy, blanketed quiet that seems to absorb all thought and movement. There is no wind here in the center of the wide square. The ancient stones hold no residual warmth from the day, radiating only a cool, neutral stillness. For a few long, unbroken minutes, the guard simply exists in the space, becoming a part of the deep, 2,000-year-old sleep of the city. He is not a trespasser in this ancient world. He is its caretaker, watching over the empty pedestals and the smooth white travertine while the rest of the world hurries through its own modern night. Eventually, he takes a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and prepares to turn away from the temple and head toward the western exit of the forum. But before he turns, his eyes are drawn naturally upward, past the towering ruined columns of the Temple of Jupiter, and toward the northern horizon beyond the city walls. The night sky is vast and clear, a deep, velvety indigo heavily dusted with thousands of bright, steady stars. But directly behind the temple, the brilliant field of constellations is abruptly cut off. Rising up from the earth, blotting out a massive section of the starry sky, is a gigantic, absolute blackness. It is a gigantic, sweeping silhouette, a void so dense and heavy that it commands the entire northern horizon. It is not a cloud, and it is not an optical illusion. It is a physical, geological presence, resting quietly in the dark, just a few miles beyond the boundaries of the ancient city. The true identity of this towering, starless void will become entirely clear as our patrol nears its final phase, and that detail will matter again before dawn. Pompeii is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the empty streets of stone, but inside the walls, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
The guard takes a final, quiet look at the wide, smooth expanse of the forum. The pale moonlight continues to wash over the white travertine slabs and the empty stone pedestals, maintaining its silent vigil over the civic heart of the city. He turns away from the Temple of Jupiter, leaving the monumental center behind, and begins to walk toward the eastern edges of the archaeological park. His boots carry him back onto the heavy, dark basalt paving stones of the secondary streets. The transition is subtle but clear. The sweeping, open acoustics of the Grand Plaza gently fold away, replaced once again by the close, intimate echoes of the residential neighborhoods. He is moving toward the physical boundary of the site, but this boundary is not marked by the ancient 8-meter-high defensive walls we visited earlier. This boundary is something entirely different. It is a boundary of time and earth. As he walks further east, the ruined houses begin to change. The cleared, meticulously excavated homes give way to structures that are only partially visible. Soon, the street he is walking down simply stops.
It does not lead to a gate or an intersection. It ends abruptly at a massive, towering cliff face of dark, packed earth. This is the edge of the unexcavated city. You would expect a ruined city, continuously explored by archaeologists for over 2.5 centuries, to have yielded all of its secrets long ago, leaving nothing but empty stone for modern thieves to take. Instead, roughly a third of Pompeii remains completely buried. It sits locked beneath millions of tons of compacted volcanic debris, entirely untouched since the 1st century. Behind this towering wall of earth lie undiscovered streets, unread political slogans painted on hidden walls, and intact homes holding the silent, undisturbed artifacts of daily Roman life. The guard stops at the heavy chain-link fence that modern authorities have erected to separate the excavated ruins from this massive plateau of untouched earth. He shines his flashlight up the sheer face of the cliff. In the bright yellow beam, the composition of the soil is incredibly clear. It is not ordinary dirt. It is a dense, stratified layer cake of geology. Thick bands of gray ash, topped by heavy layers of small, porous pumice stones, all compacted into a solid mass by the weight of 2 millennia. This unexcavated frontier is a place of immense scientific value. It is a quiet reserve, deliberately left untouched by modern archaeologists so that future generations, armed with more advanced technology, might one day uncover its secrets with perfect precision. But this hidden wealth also makes the perimeter a target. The guard turns his flashlight off, letting the darkness rush back into the street. He looks up at the high corner of a ruined brick wall standing right on the edge of the boundary fence. Here, returning from our earlier path down the Via dell'Abbondanza, we find that same piece of modern technology. Bolted discreetly into the ancient Roman mortar is a matte black cylinder, roughly the size of a human forearm.
At the center of its dark glass lens, a tiny pinpoint infrared light pulses with a faint, steady rhythm. This is a thermal imaging camera, part of a vast, highly sophisticated, and entirely silent modern nervous system overlaid on the ancient stone. It is designed to see perfectly in the absolute dark, registering the invisible heat signatures of anything moving through the ruins. 2,000 years ago, the ancient watchmen, the vigiles, patrolled these streets with flickering terracotta oil lamps, scanning the dark for the sudden, terrifying glow of a structural fire. Today, the threat is no longer fire. The threat comes from the tombaroli, the clandestine tomb raiders and antiquities thieves who operate in the shadows of the modern black market. The tombaroli are not careless vandals. They are methodical, highly organized criminals who understand the immense financial value of what lies buried behind the cliff face of volcanic earth. Over the decades, they have developed a dangerous and illegal expertise. Operating entirely outside the main gates of the archaeological park, often starting from the basements of private modern houses or abandoned farm buildings in the surrounding countryside, they dig narrow, claustrophobic tunnels deep into the unexcavated sections of the ancient city. Their goal is to bypass the modern security gates entirely, tunneling blindly through the dense ash to break through the hidden walls of unexcavated Roman villas. Once inside, they strip the walls of their priceless frescoes, chisel away delicate floor mosaics, and gather up untouched bronze coins and terracotta pottery, pulling them back through the dark tunnels to be sold illegally to unscrupulous private collectors around the world. It is a quiet, subterranean theft, an erasure of history that destroys the archaeological context forever.
To combat this, the modern defense of Pompeii relies on a seamless, coordinated effort. The matte black cylinder on the wall above the guard is just one of hundreds of highly sensitive electronic eyes watching the perimeter. They do not emit loud sirens or flash blinding lights. When they detect an unauthorized heat signature moving through the ruins, they simply send a silent, immediate digital alert to a secure control room located just outside the ancient walls. The guard reaches down to his heavy leather belt and rests his gloved hand on his two-way radio. Throughout the night, he is in constant, quiet contact with that control room. If an alert is triggered, he will be guided directly to the location, moving swiftly and silently over the familiar basalt stones. But the guard is not alone in this defense. The protection of this UNESCO World Heritage Site extends far beyond the ancient city walls, operating in a highly structured, dual-layered system. As the guard stands quietly at the edge of the unexcavated earth, a faint, rhythmic sound drifts over the high stone perimeter from the modern world outside. It is the slow, heavy crunch of thick rubber tires rolling at a crawl over loose gravel. Just beyond the ancient fortifications, patrolling the exterior boundaries of the park, are the Carabinieri TPC. The Comando Carabinieri per il Tutela Patrimonio Culturale is Italy's specialized elite cultural heritage police force. They are the art squad, highly trained officers dedicated entirely to the protection of national history and the disruption of the illicit antiquities trade.
Tonight, they are circling the massive 66-hectare site in their dark blue patrol vehicles. They move slowly, their headlights sweeping across the modern fields and the dense foliage that butts up against the ancient walls. They are watching for the subtle signs of the tombaroli, a hastily parked van on a quiet access road, the faint glow of a flashlight in an abandoned orchard, or the freshly turned earth of a new illegal tunnel entrance. The coordination between the inside and the outside is seamless. The site guards hold the interior grid, walking the ancient pavements, checking the heavy iron padlocks on the storerooms, and monitoring the deep shadows of the forum. The Carabinieri TPC hold the modern exterior, sealing the perimeter against any incursion from the 21st century. The guard unclips his radio, bringing it up to his shoulder. He presses the transmission button. A short, quiet burst of static cuts through the cold night air, followed by his calm voice checking in with the control room, confirming his position at the eastern boundary. A moment later, the radio crackles again. It is the control room operator, acknowledging his location and confirming that the Carabinieri patrol on the outer perimeter has just passed his sector. Everything is clear. The perimeter is secure. He clips the radio back onto his belt. The brief intrusion of modern electronic voices fades instantly, swallowed entirely by the immense, heavy silence of the buried city. The guard looks up at the towering cliff of compacted ash and pumice. To know that a third of an ancient Roman city sits perfectly intact just a few feet away, suspended quietly in the dark earth, is a deeply humbling realization. It requires a tremendous amount of restraint and respect to leave it untouched, to guard it not just for what it is, but for what it will eventually become when the time is right. The Tombaroli view the unexcavated earth as a resource to be stripped. The guard, the cameras, and the Carabinieri TPC view it as a sleeping patient to be protected. He steps away from the chain-link fence, leaving the matte black camera to its silent infrared vigil.
His patrol of the deep interior is nearly complete. He has walked the steep incline of the Porta Marina, traced the dry water channels of the Castellum Aquae, and stood in the vast, empty calm of the Forum. Now it is time to complete the circuit, to head back toward the outer edges of the city as the long night begins its slow turn toward morning. He begins to walk northward, following the ragged edge of the unexcavated zone. As the ruined walls of the houses fall away to his right, giving him an unobstructed view of the horizon, he looks up into the deep indigo sky. There, resting massively against the distant stars, is that same towering absolute blackness we saw from the Forum. It is a gigantic, sweeping silhouette that commands the entire landscape, a profound geological weight that defines everything about this ancient city. The true nature of this massive, silent neighbor, and the origin of those tiny, weightless gray stones we found in the high corners of the water tower, will finally be addressed as our guard reaches the end of his watch. And that detail will matter before the sun rises.
The patrol has entered its deepest, quietest phase. It is that profound, suspended hour of the night, sometime around 4 in the morning, when the earth has completely surrendered all the residual warmth of the previous day, and the air is at its absolute coldest. The guard's breath forms tiny, faint plumes of white vapor that vanish almost instantly into the dark. He leaves the heavy chain-link fence of the unexcavated eastern perimeter behind, stepping back onto the familiar, deeply grooved basalt paving stones of the cleared city grid. His boots maintain their slow, hypnotic rhythm. Crunch, pause, crunch. It is a sound he has listened to for hours, a steady, metronomic heartbeat that has accompanied him from the steep incline of the Porta Marina, past the dry basins of the public fountains, and through the wide, smooth expanse of the Forum. He has walked kilometers over the heavy volcanic rock tonight, his heavy flashlight cutting a safe, illuminated path through the shadows. He is moving northward now, returning toward the high ground near the Vesuvian gate to complete the vast, looping circuit of his watch. As he walks, the tightly packed brick walls of the residential neighborhoods begin to thin out once again. The grid becomes less dense, giving way to open gardens, ruined porticos, and wide stretches of low masonry. With the tall architectural barriers removed, the guard's field of vision expands dramatically, opening up to the vast night sky. He stops at a wide intersection near the northern edge of the city. He reaches forward with his thumb and clicks his flashlight off, plunging himself back into the cool silver wash of the ambient moonlight. He stands perfectly still, letting his eyes adjust, and looks directly toward the northern horizon. There it is, the immense, sweeping silhouette that we first glimpsed from the center of the Forum, the towering, starless void that commands the entire landscape. It is Mount Vesuvius. Even in the pitch black of the night, its physical presence is undeniable. It does not look like a traditional, perfectly conical mountain. It is a massive, sprawling geological complex with a distinct, jagged double peak. To the left is the high, curved ridge of Mount Soma, the ancient remnants of a much larger, older caldera. To the right is the great cone of Vesuvius itself, rising steeply into the dark. Together, they form a colossal, heavy saddle of earth and rock that looms over the Bay of Naples, a sleeping giant resting quietly just a few miles beyond the ancient city walls. You would expect a volcano with such a famous, catastrophic history to be viewed by the people living beneath it as nothing but a source of death and devastation,
a looming threat to be avoided at all costs. Instead, for centuries before the eruption in 79 AD, this massive mountain was the very source of Pompeii's immense wealth and life. The ancient Romans didn't even know Vesuvius was a volcano. In the 1st century, it did not have a jagged, smoking crater. It was a beautiful, soaring, single-peaked mountain, completely covered from its base to its summit in dense, lush green forests and sprawling terraced vineyards. The soil on the slopes of the mountain, enriched by prehistoric eruptions that had occurred thousands of years before the city was even founded, was incredibly fertile. It was packed with potassium and phosphorus, the perfect minerals for growing heavy, sweet grapes and thick, rich olive groves.
Pompeii was a boomtown built entirely on the agricultural bounty provided by that mountain. The citizens grew spectacularly wealthy, exporting Vesuvian wine and olive oil across the Mediterranean, and the very ground the city was built upon, the heavy basalt paving stones under the guards' boots, the dark papamonte stone used in the deep foundations of the defensive walls, the elevated plateau that gave the city its strategic view of the sea, all of it was ancient lava, a gift from the mountain's distant prehistoric past. Vesuvius was not their destroyer. For generations, it was their silent, generous benefactor. The guard stands in the dark street, his hands resting comfortably on his heavy leather belt, and looks up at the massive black silhouette blocking out the northern stars. The mountain is dormant now. It is heavily monitored by modern seismologists, ringed by dozens of highly sensitive sensors that track every minute shift in the earth, every subtle change in temperature. Tonight, the sensors are quiet. The mountain is fast asleep. As he stares at the sheer, overwhelming scale of the geological giant, his mind naturally drifts back to his earlier stop at the Castellum Aquae, the grand brick water tower situated just a short walk from where he now stands. He remembers shining his flashlight high up into the ruined corners of the dry, ancient masonry, illuminating the thick, packed accumulation of those tiny, highly porous gray stones. The mystery of those tiny, weightless stones is intimately, inextricably tied to the massive silhouette on the horizon. When the catastrophic eruption finally occurred in the late summer of 79 AD, the mountain did not destroy Pompeii with a violent, sweeping river of liquid fire. There was no sudden, apocalyptic flood of red-hot lava crashing through the city gates. The reality of the geology was far stranger and far more methodical. The magma deep inside Vesuvius was incredibly rich in dissolved gases, trapped under immense pressure. When the mountain finally ruptured, that superheated rock was blasted more than 20 miles straight up into the stratosphere. As the liquid rock hit the freezing air of the upper atmosphere, it cooled almost instantly. But because it was so full of expanding gas, it did not form heavy, solid boulders. Instead, it frothed and hardened into a lightweight, glassy foam. This was pumice, known to geologists as lapilli. It is volcanic rock that is so porous and so full of trapped air that it can literally float on water. This is what fell on Pompeii. For 18 relentless hours, the sky above the city turned completely black, and millions of tons of these tiny, weightless gray stones rained down from the heavens. They fell with the soft hissing sound of heavy hail. Because they were so light, they did not immediately crush the buildings. Instead, they simply accumulated. They fell steadily and quietly, piling up on the rooftops, filling the open courtyards, and clogging the narrow streets. The tiny gray stones we saw resting in the high corners of the Castellum Aquae are the exact same stones that fell on that fateful day.
They drifted down from the roaring sky, settling into the brickwork of the water tower, burying the 3 ancient water channels and slowly entombing the entire civic infrastructure. The guard looks down at the street beneath his feet, imagining the sheer volume of material it took to bury a 66-hectare city. The pumice piled up to a depth of nearly 3 meters, swallowing the public fountains, burying the heavy stepping stones at the intersections, and covering the tall stone bollards at the entrance to the forum. When the heavier, denser waves of volcanic ash finally swept down the mountain the following morning, they sealed the pumice in place, locking the city away in an airtight subterranean vault. It was a catastrophic event, an undeniable tragedy for the people who lived here. But as the guard looks out over the quiet, sleeping ruins, he understands the profound paradox of the mountain. By burying the city so completely, by sealing it under millions of tons of soft pumice and dense ash, Vesuvius inadvertently became the greatest preservationist in human history. The mountain stopped time. It protected the delicate frescoes from the eroding winds and the fading sun. It kept the heavy basalt streets safe from the destructive crawl of medieval modernization. It created the perfect hollow voids that Giuseppe Fiorelli would later fill with white plaster to give us the haunting, deeply human casts resting safely in the storerooms. The mountain took the city away from the ancient Romans, but it preserved it perfectly for the modern world. It is a strange, quiet thought, one that the god carries with him as he begins the final leg of his patrol. He turns away from the towering silhouette of Vesuvius and begins to walk westward, following the gentle curve of the northern wall. He is heading back toward his starting point, completing the massive kilometers-long loop of his nightly watch. The deep, heavy darkness of the night is finally beginning to soften. The change is imperceptible at first, a subtle thinning of the shadows rather than a true arrival of light. High above, the brightest stars in the deep indigo sky begin to lose their sharp, piercing clarity, fading gently into a softer, washed-out gray. Nautical twilight is approaching. The guard can feel the shift in the air. The deep, static cold of the night breaks slightly, stirred by a new, fresh breeze moving in off the Bay of Naples. This is the morning wind, sweeping over the ancient ruins, rustling the dry grass that grows between the ruined walls, and carrying the faint, salty scent of the sea. As he walks down the sloping incline toward the Herculaneum Gate, the world outside the ancient walls begins to stir. Far off in the distance, miles beyond the archaeological park, he can hear the faint, low rumble of a heavy transport truck on the modern Italian highway, a deep acoustic vibration carrying through the crisp morning air. A few minutes later, the sharp, metallic squeal of an early commuter train echoes from the nearby station in the modern town of Pompeii.
The 21st century is waking up. The people who live in the houses surrounding the park are turning on their lights, brewing their coffee, and preparing for the rush and noise of a new day. Soon, the modern perimeter gates will be unlocked, the ticketing booths will open, the tour guides will retrieve their numbered flags and brightly colored umbrellas, and the thousands of daytime visitors will begin to pour through the archways, filling the ancient grid with the chaotic, overlapping hum of a dozen different languages. But for a few more minutes, the city remains entirely his. The guard reaches a high vantage point near the western edge of the city, a place where the ruined walls fall away, offering a panoramic view of the ancient grid below. He stops and looks out over the 66 hectares of stone, brick, and basalt. In the gathering dawn, the ruins take on a soft, ethereal beauty. The white travertine of the Forum glows faintly in the pale morning light. The heavy, dark paving stones of the Via dell'Abbondanza stretch out in a long, unbroken line, waiting patiently for the thousands of footsteps that will soon cross them. The heavy, unyielding walls of the Castellum Aquae stand firmly against the lightning sky, holding the memory of the rushing mountain water deep in their dry brick basins. The city has survived another night. The thermal cameras bolted to the ancient mortar have watched the unexcavated earth without incident. The carabinieri have held the outer perimeter secure. The heavy iron padlock on the steel mesh door of the storeroom remains firmly clicked into place. The plaster casts, the terracotta amphorae, and the delicate frescoes are exactly as they were when the sun went down. The guard takes a deep, slow breath, letting the fresh morning air fill his lungs. He feels a deep, quiet satisfaction in the ache of his legs and the chill in his hands. His watch is over. He has walked the ancient grid, guarding the silence, protecting the immense, enduring legacy of a city that refuses to be forgotten. He reaches down, resting his hand one last time on the heavy brass keyring at his hip, and prepares to walk down the steep incline to open the heavy iron gates of the Porta Marina. The sun is about to break over the horizon, bringing the light, the heat, and the noise back to the Campania region. The modern world is ready to reclaim the space. But for now, in these final, lingering moments of the shadow, the ancient world remains perfectly, beautifully still. Pompeii is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the empty streets of stone, but inside the walls, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark. The heavy iron gates of the Porta Marina groan a low metallic sigh as they are pulled apart. The guard turns the heavy brass key in the modern padlock, slipping it free with a final, decisive click. He pushes the gates open, and the bright, sharp light of the Campanian morning spills onto the ancient basalt pavement. Waiting on the other side, standing on the modern concrete, is the morning shift. They carry clipboards and thermoses of hot coffee, already speaking in the rapid, energetic cadence of the 21st century. The guard steps through the archway, handing the heavy ring of brass keys to his relief. He gives a quiet nod, a silent transfer of responsibility, and begins his slow walk toward the staff exit. His shift is over. He is returning to the daylight, to the noise of the traffic and the waking world. But for you, there is no need to follow him out into the sun. You would expect the arrival of the morning crowds to instantly erase the quiet magic of the ruins, turning the ancient city back into a crowded, noisy attraction. Instead, the profound peace of the night watch remains perfectly intact, locked safely away in the quiet spaces of your mind. You have seen the city as it was meant to be seen. You know the secrets of the dark basalt grid. You know the invisible downhill paths of the cold mountain water, and you know the quiet, passive glow of the white marble stones guiding the way through the deepest dark.
You have felt the smooth, polished grooves worn into the stone by 1,000 ancient hands, and you know that the massive black mountain on the horizon is not a monster, but a silent guardian of time. The city of Pompeii has endured for over 2,000 years. It is a masterpiece of stone, water, and earth, meticulously mapped and quietly protected by those who understand its value. It does not need you to stay awake to keep it safe. The massive walls are strong, the iron gates are locked, the modern watch is set, and the ancient one never truly ends. There is nothing left to solve tonight. There is nothing left to guard. It is time to let the darkness settle completely. Let your breathing match the slow, steady rhythm of the empty streets. Let the heavy stones hold the weight of the world so that you don't have to. Thank you for walking with us tonight on History for Sleepyheads. Sleep well and good night.